Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping to a really provocative stack of source material. It all points toward one central idea, that the major conflicts we're seeing globally and, well, here at home, aren't just random. They might be part of a bigger directed agenda.
That's the core argument, yes. These documents, they lay out what's essentially a unified theory, suggesting a deliberate push towards, escalating conflict, economic shifts, erosion of sovereignty. And it's all framed as, well, the intentional work of certain global groups. We're talking geopolitics, economics, domestic policy. It's all connected in these analyses.
Right. It's a lot to take in. So to help make sense of it, we've broken it down into three main themes for you. First, there's the geopolitical escalation foreign policy, strategic moves, maybe blunders. Second, the economic and cultural war. This looks at alleged plans for financial upheaval and attacks on meritocracy. And finally, the domestic subversion, focusing on what the sources claim is a blueprint for internal chaos right here in the U.S. Okay, let's dig in. Starting globally then. The sources really zeroed in on Russia and Ukraine. The main takeaway isn't just that it's a war, but that it's being used, supposedly, as a tool. A tool pushing NATO, the U.S., and Russia towards what the sources are calling an extreme escalatory phase. Pretty stark language.
Extremely stark. And what's interesting, or maybe alarming, is what they pinpoint as the trigger. It's not just troop numbers, it's specific weapons. The documents say Russia sees the U.S. giving Ukraine long-range Tomahawks as, well, basically direct involvement in the war. Sources quote Moscow viewing this as potentially the start of a new world war, a nuclear one.
Wow. And do they list specific actions, these alleged provocations, things NATO might be doing to, as they put it, suck the United States directly into full conflict?
They do provide examples, yes. Some alleged incidents mentioned. Well, there's the claim from 2 years back about missiles landing in Poland, initially blamed on Russia, but later traced to Ukraine. More recently, something called Operation Spiderweb. This supposedly involved smuggled drones flying huge distances, like 4,000 miles from Ukraine. And these drones allegedly hit parts of Russia's nuclear triad, specifically Bear bombers near Japan. That's a huge claim. And then there's talk of NATO propaganda suggesting Russia has special forces ready for terror attacks across Europe.
Okay, but if it's that dangerous, potentially nuclear, it raises a question about the source's own logic here. Why would Europe keep pushing? The analysts seem to think Europe should be cooperating with Russia for energy and stability, but isn't.
Well, the material describes this as a kind of delusion, specifically within the unelected EU Commission leadership. That's the claim. They argue this leadership sees a long, drawn-out conventional war with Russia, maybe 20 or 30 years, as a viable business model. The idea being to sustain a war economy and eventually break Russia into, say, 5 smaller states. So the conflict itself becomes the economic engine, according to this view. It's a pretty cynical take.
It is, and this is where the sources make a really sharp turn. They call this whole focus on Russia a strategic blunder of biblical proportions. Why such strong language? What's the blunder, according to them?
Because the argument goes, it's a massive distraction. It's pulling attention and resources away from what they see as the real existential threat, which is China.
China.
Yes. They claim China's influence is expanding everywhere, but critically, it's moving to control the global supply of rare earth minerals. We're talking like 95% of the world's supply.
And those are crucial for, well, everything modern,
Yeah.
right? Phones, computers, military tech.
Absolutely essential. Cell phones, computers, advanced avionics, you name it. Military hardware relies on them. So the analysts are saying, look, cutting off this supply, that's effectively an act of war, a serious one, against Western tech and military readiness. So the blunder is getting bogged down in Europe while China executes this resource chokehold. All hands should be on deck for China, they argue, not this proxy war.
Okay, so that military distraction then leads into the next big theme in these sources.
Yeah.
A planned financial takedown. How do they connect these global moves to, say, the U.S. economy or the dollar?
Well, the sources suggest the weakening of the dollar isn't just, bad luck or poor policy. They argue that major global financial bodies, the IMF, World Bank, Goldman Sachs are mentioned, have decided that the way to handle global debt is through inflation, managed, deliberate inflation, and that the UN and WEF Great Reset agendas are actively pushing for stagflation.
Stagflation. That's high inflation and recession, right?
Yeah.
Brutal combination.
Exactly. High inflation plus recession or even depression. And the claimed purpose, the sources are blunt, it's to create a worldwide serf system. The idea is if people are economically stressed, dependent, dealing with scarcity, They become more manageable slaves. That's the language used. This economic pain is supposedly the path to what the authors call neo-feudalistic capitalism.
Neo-feudalism, what does that actually look like according to these documents?
Yeah.
And how would it be enforced?
Well, fundamentally, it means the end of national borders as we know them and less individualism. The alleged plan involves breaking down borders, moving people away from dense urban living, and pushing towards a sort of reduced agrarian society, a much smaller population too. And the enforcement tools mentioned, things we hear about like 15-minute cities, carbon lockdowns. The sources frame these not as conveniences or environmental measures, but as control mechanisms, ways to restrict movement, commerce, and basically lock in a lower standard of living.
To get to that smaller controlled population, the analysts point to direct actions against the food supply. Some really strange examples are cited.
They are strange. The documents mention what they call deliberate sabotage of farming. Big agricultural centers like in the Netherlands, Ireland, Sri Lanka. And the justification given is often environmental, but framed as extreme, like shutting down farms because literally cows pass gas, methane concerns.
It sounds almost absurd when you put it like that.
It does. But the sources argue that the absurdity is part of the point. It masks the real alleged goal, creating food shortages, resource scarcity, basically slow starvation tactics to help achieve those population reduction goals needed for this neo-feudal model. And this ties directly into the cultural war aspect. The ultimate target, these analysts claim, is the destruction of Christian civilization. And more broadly, the entire Western model, ideas of individual freedom, justice, private property.
Which connects right back to the attack of meritocracy you mentioned earlier. The idea that the West was built on people succeeding through skill and effort, and that's being dismantled.
Exactly. The sources document what they see as a clear agenda to replace merit-based systems, to put unqualified people in charge. They cite examples like pushing for an undocumented person as a school superintendent, regardless of qualifications. Or they analyze how comments about, say, pilot standards were allegedly misrepresented to suggest lowering them. The underlying point is, if you get rid of merit, especially in critical jobs, things fall apart. Civilization becomes inefficient, tribal, destroy merit, destroy function.
Okay, so if the global conflict is the distraction and the economic and cultural war weakens the foundation, then the final piece, according to these sources, is the domestic front, weaponizing instability here in the U.S. What's this playbook for internal chaos they talk about?
Right. They spend a fair bit of time on what they call the Podesta Plan. Now, they frame this not as some secret plot, but as an actual documented war game exercise done by the Democrat Party years ago, specifically designed to plan for what would happen if Donald Trump won the 2020 election.
Okay, a war game scenario.
Yeah.
What did it envision happening?
The plan, as described in the sources, involved blue states and cities moving to secede almost immediately. California and Washington were named as starting a Western alliance. The pretext would be things like disagreements over migrants or healthcare policy, but the goal was to fuel civil unrest. And here's the really disturbing part. The sources claim the scenario escalated this unrest deliberately towards a planned massacre of migrants, a truly horrific event designed specifically to trigger a widespread, race-based civil war in America.
That's shocking. And they connect this historical plan to things happening now, to current rhetoric.
They do. They point to recent reports, for instance, of Senator Chuck Schumer allegedly calling for a forceful uprising on MSNBC. This was reportedly linked to the Letitia James indictment case. The analysts interpret this kind of language as active agitation, stirring the pot, pushing towards those pre-planned civil conflict scenarios from the Podesta documents.
Which leads to the final mechanism. How do they silence people who push back? The sources talk about a weaponized judiciary. They lay out a specific model for this.
Yes, they call it the Alex Jones model of political destruction. It's described as a process. Step 1. The target gets sued for defamation. Importantly, not for a crime, but for expressing an opinion, maybe questioning an official story. Step 2. Judges, often noted as Democrat appointed in the sources, use legal technicalities. Things like default judgments for supposedly failing discovery requests. This bypasses a full jury trial on the actual defamation claim. The target is found guilty by default.
So, guilty without really getting to defend themselves on the core issue.
That's the claim. Step 3 is what the sources call show trials. These aren't about justice, but about setting damages. And the judgments are enormous, unpayable. Billion-dollar figures are mentioned. And the sources stress this, the goal isn't the money. Nobody expects to collect $1 billion. The goal is step 4. Seize the person's company, shut down their platform, silence their voice, remove them entirely. It's presented as a template for legal assassination of dissent.
And they say this isn't just a theory, it's happening now.
They provide a current example. Mike Lindell of MyPillow. The material states he was defaulted just days before the sources were compiled. He's now facing seizure of his company. And the explicit reason cited: because he publicly questioned the 2020 election results. The sources present this as proof the model is active. A warning, really, that challenging certain narratives invites this kind of judicial and financial destruction. So if you pull all these threads together, what the sources are presenting is a picture of a coordinated system. You have geopolitical conflict as a smokescreen, economic sabotage to create dependency, and planned domestic chaos, all allegedly aimed at dismantling Western concepts of individualism, sovereignty, freedom.
And interestingly, the sources don't just leave it at politics or economics. They bring in a moral, even spiritual dimension, arguing that recognizing absolute good and evil is crucial. They say totalitarian systems often work by offering false choices. The example given is like arm Hitler or arm Stalin, basically, making people feel hopeless, like the fight is too big.
Exactly. And that's why the ultimate defense, according to these analysts, isn't necessarily mass movements or big organizations. It's the individual. It's about personal spiritual inclination, maintaining personal virtue, integrity. They argue that the biggest threat to these grand controlling systems is actually just the independent moral person. Because in their words, nothing is bigger than just one person.
Which leads us to our final thought for you today. Consider this. If the greatest trick of these alleged systems of control is to convince you that your individual actions, your personal virtue, don't really matter, and that security or freedom can only come from large-scale violence or government intervention, then what small, nonviolent personal choice could you make right now today to uphold and protect that unique, sovereign 1776 civilization, that spirit of individual liberty that the sources claim is under such deliberate attack? Something to think about. We'll leave that with you.